Hello, our guest is Dr. Michael Carpenter, Ambassador of the United States to the OSCE. Ambassador Carpenter, thank you for this opportunity. Despite efforts by the mediators, including the United States, Baku announced yesterday that it will not participate in the Washington negotiation, meanwhile strongly criticizing the United States for its bias. How would you react to that?
Well, look, we continue to think it's extremely important for Armenia and Azerbaijan to normalize relations so that there is peace, stability in the region, transport links are opened. We think it's for the benefit of everybody and certainly for the United States to see peace and stability in this region. And so we're going to keep trying to facilitate that through the means that we have available. And we hope that the parties understand as well that this is in their interest too.
The Assistant Secretary of State said that the coming weeks will be critical in terms of negotiation between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Can it be said that Baku's rejection has closed this window of opportunity?
No, look, I wouldn't say that any window is closed at the moment. You know, I wouldn't put fix a timeline to the negotiations process, and I wouldn't have done that 6 months ago or a year ago. I think it's important that all parties redouble efforts to achieve durable peace and security in the region because, again, that and upholding human rights and democracy is critically important for us, and so we're going to keep doing it.
So Azerbaijan has refused to go to Washington. It is also boycotting the Brussels platform. Isn't there a concern that the West will lose its leadership? I mean, especially since Russia is trying very hard to organize a meeting in Moscow.
Well, look, the parties will avail themselves of those channels that are there to enable them to make progress in the negotiations. You know, of course, I represent the United States. I think we made a very sustained and principled effort to offer our good offices for this cause. Certainly, Secretary Blinken has devoted a lot of his time and effort and resources into supporting the negotiations and trying to get this normalization agreement across the line. And so we will continue to offer those good offices. Again, ultimately, it's up to the parties to decide which process is most conducive to their interests.
Mr. Ambassador, does Washington see a prospect of cooperation with Moscow in this matter? After all, the OSCE Minsk group still formally exists and it hasn't been dissolved.
Look, what I would say is this. Russia has proven over the course of the last 18 months plus that it is not reliable in any sphere, having violently and brutally assaulted its neighbor. And not just that, but having lied about various other international commitments and having broken those commitments repeatedly in recent years. I need not remind you of the fact that Russia is stationing troops in Moldova and Georgia without the consent of the host nation. And there's any number of other instances that I could point to that show that Moscow is really not a reliable party in negotiations.
But on the other hand, Moscow sees a threat that the West is actually trying to push Russia out of this region.
Look, as I said at the beginning, the interest for the United States is to see a sustainable and durable peace. It has to be a just peace. It has to be based, of course, on the interests of both sides. But ultimately, we believe this is the way forward. I mean, look at what conflict has done. It displaces people from their homes. It leads to tragedies, both on an individual scale, for families, for entire communities. And it creates resentments that can last for a long time. This is in nobody's interest. That is why we have approached this process from the very beginning with an interest in trying to find a solution.
And now, are there contacts within the framework of the OSCE Minsk group? Have there been any contacts?
I am not aware of any contacts in the Minsk group format. Of course, the Minsk group continues to exist until the parties decide otherwise, but no contacts right now.
And what about contacts outside the group? I just want to remind that the Politico reported that the US, Russian and EU diplomats met in Turkey in September, just days before Azerbaijan is attacked. What was the meeting?
Look, there have been a number of reports that are based on false information pertaining to what are called track 2 discussions between former officials, think tank, pundits, experts, and so on and so forth. I am not aware of meetings of U.S. officials with Russian counterparts, which, again, Jake Sullivan, our national security advisor, was very clear. When it comes to certain issues that are of such importance, like strategic stability, we're prepared to have a discussion. But at the moment, the other side, meaning Russia, is simply not approaching these sorts of topics responsibly, just the opposite, I would say. And so we see no scope for having a productive discussion in the near term.
Mr. Ambassador, do you consider that the goal of Minsk Group, I mean at the beginning of the conflict, that was to reach a peaceful and diplomatic settlement, has been solved now?
Well, look, I'm not going to go back and look retrospectively at what the Minsk Group has done, but clearly until we have a sustainable, durable peace deal, an agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan, our work will not be finished.
Why it wasn't possible to prevent the forced displacement of ethnic Armenians after all assurances had been made by the United States that ethnic cleansing would not be tolerated?
Look, I think it's very important that we recognize that over 100,000 people have left Nagorno-Karabakh. They have left behind their belongings. Some of them didn't even have the chance to pack a suitcase with the clothes. They leave behind homes, communities, friendships, and the place where, for many, their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents lived. So this is a tragedy, and we want to ensure that we do support, and this is where, from the OSCE side as well, we are very much focused on ensuring that the principle in international law of safe and dignified return and sustainable reintegration is upheld. And we will look at working with our various international partners to see how best we can support that.
So my next question is about that. Washington says that Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians should have the right to return to their homeland. Should it be according to Azerbaijani laws or by international guarantees, as the Armenian side insists? Is Washington ready, I mean, to put pressure on Azerbaijan in this matter? So
the principle of safe and dignified return and then sustainable reintegration is a concept in international law supported by organizations like the IOM, the International Organization of Migration, and others. The OSCE is potentially interested in playing a role in this sort of an endeavor as well. And so it has to be based, to answer your question, it has to be based on international standards and the full respect for the human rights of every individual and for their dignity as well.
On the other hand, Washington warns that there will be a strong reaction if Azerbaijan uses force to open a land corridor, I mean to Nakhichevan, to Armenia. Do you see such a danger?
Let me say this as unequivocally as I possibly can. The principle of sovereignty and territorial integrity, the inviolability of borders, and the principle that force should never be used, those are principles of international law. They're part of the Helsinki Final Act. They're also elements of the UN Charter. It is the obligation of all members of the international community to uphold those principles.
Mr. Ambassador, the Senate proposes to the President to suspend military aid to Azerbaijan for 2 years, if I'm not mistaken. Do you expect it to reach the stage where it will be signed into law by the President?
Look, I can't predict what the next steps will be. All I can do is reiterate what Assistant Secretary Jim O'Brien said the other day in front of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, that there will be consequences. And clearly that will play out over the course of the coming days and weeks and months.
And do you agree with the assessment of the Senate that this ban should be understood as a law for the protection of Armenia?
Well, look, in terms of everything that the administration does, we always confer with our partners in Congress, including in the United States Senate, and we seek their advice and consent for a lot of what we do. And that remains the case, so we're going to be consulting with Congress on the best way forward. And I think Assistant Secretary O'Brien's testimony was the first step in what will be several interactions with Congress over the coming weeks.
but more is needed for the protection of Armenia, according to Armenian authorities. Is there a prospect of closer military cooperation between Yerevan and Washington?
Well, look, I was just talking with some colleagues about the last time I was here in Yerevan when I was working for the Pentagon as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. And back then I had a good cooperative relationship with the Armenian Ministry of Defense. We were in fact talking about how we could cooperate on the training of a peacekeeping battalion that Armenia operated then. I think in the intervening years, our defense relationship has grown closer, and there's more scope for engaging in joint activities, military to military, as well as on the civilian defense side. So if I understand correctly, there has been more money that is put into the pipeline for foreign military financing and those sorts of activities. So I expect that this sphere of our bilateral relationship, if you will be expanding over the course of time.
What would you say about the possibility of providing or selling weapons? France, for example, has taken this step.
Of course, it's up to every country to decide, what sorts of military relationships and defense relationships they have with other countries. I can't foresee. I'm not here to make any announcements, but as I said, from my perspective, having worked as a Pentagon official on this region of the world, I can see how our defense cooperation has developed over time and has become more robust.
Mr. Ambassador, what about your visit? What kind of agenda do you have in Yerevan?
Well, I'm here for the opening of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, which is a very important opportunity for parliamentarians from across the OSCE region to come together to support the issues and the countries that are most in our focus right now. So that includes, of course, defending Ukraine and standing up for its rights against this brutal invasion from Russia, but also looking at other countries further afield, including Armenia, which I have to say, from the perspective of the OSCE, holds a very special place, because this is now a model of how a country can reform itself and deepen its democratic institutions and take on rule of law issues, in a very productive and constructive way. So we see what's happened here over the course of the last few years as a model that could be emulated elsewhere, and in fact one where the OSCE could deploy resources and some of the institutions that we have to support this process. I would remind you, there was an OSCE mission here for 17 years. Unfortunately, that mission went away in 2017, but we continue to look for ways to support Armenia with its democratic development.
And my last question about Ukrainian crisis, if you don't mind. Do you agree with the fears that the Middle East conflict has pushed Russia's war against Ukraine to the background?
I wouldn't say so. I think that Ukraine remains, certainly in the OSCE, remains the center of attention. But certainly the war between Israel and Hamas poses challenges for the entire international community. And yes, of course, it adds to the list of issues that we have to contend with. That said, from the United States perspective, we are determined to continue to support Ukraine until it prevails in this war.
Thank you once again, and let me remind that our guest was Dr. Michael Carpenter, Ambassador of the United States to the OSCE.